Lyra's scream echoed through the forest as the mate bonds snapped, sending shockwaves of agony through every nerve in her body. She hit the ground hard, dirt and leaves grinding into her palms as her wolf howled in anguish. Above her, Garrett stood like a statue carved from ice, the ceremonial silver blade still gleaming in his hand. I, Garrett Ironwood, reject you, Lyra Thornfield, as my fated mate before the goddess and this pack. The words hung in the blood moon's crimson light like a death sentence. Around them, the entire Shadow Peak pack watched in stunned silence, their faces painted red by the ominous lunar glow. Lyra forced herself to her knees, tasting blood where she'd bitten her tongue. Garrett, please. Whatever Celeste told you. Don't. His voice cut through her plea like the blade in his hand. Don't make this harder than it has to be. Behind him, her stepsister Celeste dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, the picture of devastated innocence. But Lyra caught the flash of triumph in those pale green eyes, the barely concealed smirk playing at her lips. I'm sorry, sister, Celeste whispered, her voice carrying perfectly across the silent clearing. I couldn't let him live a lie anymore. What I saw behind the training grounds, with that rogue from the Moonwater pack. That's not what happened. Lyra's wolf snarled beneath her skin, claws extending. I saw you, Celeste continued, fresh tears sliding down her porcelain cheeks. In his arms. Kissing him like Garrett meant nothing to you. The lie hit the gathered wolves like wildfire. Lyra could see it in their faces, the doubt, the judgment, the confirmation of what they'd always suspected about the foundling who didn't belong. Garrett's dark eyes finally met hers, and the disgust she saw there shattered what remained of her heart. I should have known. An Omega like you was never worthy of an Alpha's devotion. Alpha Blackthorn stepped forward, his commanding presence silencing the pack's whispers. The rejection is witnessed and binding under the blood moon. Garrett Ironwood, you are free to choose another mate. Lyra struggled to her feet, her legs shaking from the trauma of the severed bond. She wanted to scream the truth, that she'd been helping Elder Rosewood deliver her grand cub that night, not meeting some mysterious rogue. But who would believe her word against Celeste's? Return to your duties, Blackthorn commanded coldly. And trouble this pack no more with your... Thundering hoofbeats cut through his words. A rider in royal blue burst into the clearing, his horse foaming at the mouth from a hard ride. Alpha Blackthorn. The messenger leaped from his mount, his face flushed with urgency. I bring word from the capital. The mood shifted instantly. Royal messengers only came with news that changed everything. Prince Rowan Stormwind, second son of King Aldrich, has chosen a bride from your pack, the messenger announced, his voice carrying across the silent clearing. Excited murmurs rippled through the crowd. A royal marriage meant protection, wealth, and unimaginable honor for Shadow Peak. The messenger's gaze swept the gathered wolves before settling on Celeste. Lady Celeste Thornfield, you have been selected to wed His Highness in 1 month's time. Celeste's face went white as fresh snow. There must be some mistake. No mistake, my lady. Prince Rowan was quite specific in his requirements. The messenger's tone carried an edge of steel. He desires a bride who understands duty above personal comfort. Lyra almost laughed at the bitter irony. Duty, a concept as foreign to Celeste as humility. I cannot marry him. Celeste's voice rose to near hysteria. Everyone knows the prince is broken. Twisted from the war. They say he's more beast than man now. Shocked gasps echoed through the clearing. Refusing a royal match was tantamount to declaring war. Alpha Blackthorn's face darkened. Celeste, you will. I have a delicate constitution, she shrieked. I cannot bear children to a crippled monster. Find someone else. The messenger's expression turned arctic. If Lady Celeste finds herself unable to fulfill this honor, perhaps another daughter of your house would be suitable. Every eye in the clearing turned to Lyra. Of course. When had she ever been anyone's first choice for anything good? Lyra will go, Blackthorn declared without hesitation. She understands her obligations to this pack. No. The word escaped before Lyra could stop it. The Alpha's eyes blazed gold with his wolf's fury. What did you say? Lyra lifted her chin, feeling something fierce and wild stir in her chest, her mother's warrior blood singing for the first time in years. I said no. I won't be your sacrificial offering. You ungrateful wretch, Blackthorn stepped forward, hand raised to strike. I wouldn't, if I were you. The messenger's quiet words froze the Alpha mid-motion. Prince Rowan is expecting a bride from Shadow Peak Pack. If you cannot provide one. He let the threat hang in the air like smoke. Everyone knew what happened to packs who disappointed the crown. They simply ceased to exist. Elder Grimwald shuffled forward, his ancient face creased with worry. Child, you know what's at stake. Without the Royal Alliance, the northern clans will overrun our territory within the year. Why should I care? Lyra shot back. You all just watched my mate reject me based on lies, and not one of you spoke in my defense. Because you're nothing. Celeste hissed, her mask of innocence finally slipping. A foundling with no bloodline, no real pack loyalty. You should be grateful we kept you alive this long. The words found their mark, but instead of breaking her, they kindled something hard and cold in Lyra's chest. You're right. I mean nothing to any of you. So I owe you nothing in return. Children will starve without this alliance, Grimwald pressed desperately. Innocent blood will be spilled. Lyra looked around the circle of faces, some pleading, others demanding, all expecting her to sacrifice herself for people who'd shown her nothing but contempt. Her gaze lingered on Garrett, who stared at the ground like a coward. His Highness expects his bride within 3 days, the messenger said. I'll return at dawn for your decision. As he mounted his horse and rode away, the pack erupted in heated arguments. Lyra started to follow, but Blackthorn's voice stopped her cold. Refuse this marriage, and you're banished tonight. With nothing but what you can carry. She turned slowly. And if I accept? You'll be treated with the respect due a royal bride. Until you leave for the capital. How magnanimous. I need time to think. You have until dawn, Blackthorn said coldly. Choose wisely, Lyra. Your pack's blood is on your hands either way. As Lyra walked away from the clearing, fragments of whispered conversations followed her. Heard strange things about the prince from the palace servants. They say he's not really disabled at all. Moves like a warrior when no one's watching. Something's not right about those war injuries. She paused at the forest's edge, straining to catch more, but the voices faded into the night wind. At her favorite thinking spot, a moss-covered boulder overlooking the valley, Lyra sat beneath the blood moon's eerie glow. She had until dawn to decide, her freedom or her pack's survival. But as the night deepened around her, one thought echoed louder than all the rest. What if the whispers about Prince Rowan were true? What if the cruel, crippled prince was just another lie, like everything else in her life? Chapter 2. The royal palace of Stormwind loomed before Lyra like a gilded prison, its soaring spires and gleaming walls designed to make visitors feel small and insignificant. Mission accomplished. 3 days of bone-jarring travel in a royal carriage had done nothing to prepare her for this moment. She'd expected grandeur, but not this overwhelming display of power that seemed to press down on her shoulders like a physical weight. Golden banners bearing the royal wolf crest snapped in the wind above her, each one worth more than her entire pack's yearly income. Lady Lyra Thornfield of Shadow Peak, announced the herald as she climbed the marble steps, her simple traveling dress a stark contrast to the opulent surroundings. Here for the royal wedding ceremony. Wedding ceremony. The words hit her like a slap. A murmur rippled through the assembled courtiers lining the grand entrance hall. Lyra caught fragments of whispered conversations. I thought she was supposed to be the bride. Quite plain, isn't she? What pack did she say she was from? Heat flooded her cheeks, but she kept her chin high and her expression neutral. She'd survived worse humiliations than curious stares from pampered nobles. The herald led her through corridors lined with portraits of stern-faced kings and queens, their painted eyes seeming to follow her progress. Crystal chandeliers cast rainbow patterns on marble floors so polished she could see her reflection. Everything screamed wealth and power, and reminded her exactly how far she was from home. His Majesty King Aldrich will receive you in the throne room, the herald said, his tone suggesting this was a great honor she didn't deserve. The massive doors to the throne room swung open with a groan that echoed through the cavernous space. Lyra's breath caught. The room was easily the size of her pack's entire meeting hall, with vaulted ceilings that disappeared into shadow and stained glass windows that painted the floor in jeweled light. On the raised dais at the far end sat King Aldrich Stormwind, a man whose presence commanded attention even from a distance. His silver hair was perfectly groomed, his bearing regal despite the lines of weariness around his eyes. To his right sat a woman who could only be Queen Isabel, elegant and cold as winter frost. But it was the figure in the wheelchair beside the throne that made Lyra's steps falter. Prince Rowan Stormwind bore little resemblance to the terrifying beast of legend. Thin to the point of frailty, he hunched in his chair like a man twice his age. A thick woolen blanket covered his legs, and when he turned his head toward her, his movements seemed labored and uncertain. "Why, Your Majesty," he said, his voice carrying a pronounced stutter that echoed embarrassingly in the vast space. "The Lady from Shadow Peak has arrived." King Aldrich barely glanced at his nephew before fixing his attention on Lyra. "Lady Thornfield. You've had a long journey for nothing, I'm afraid." "Your Majesty." Lyra managed, though her throat felt suddenly dry. "My nephew has already chosen his bride." The king's tone was matter-of-fact, as if discussing the weather. "Lady Cordelia Ashford, daughter of Duke Edmund. A much more suitable match than what your pack could offer." The words hit her like physical blows. Lyra fought to keep her expression neutral even as humiliation burned in her chest. "I see. Perhaps there was some misunderstanding with your messenger." "No misunderstanding," came a melodious voice from the shadows beside the throne. A young woman stepped into the light, and Lyra's heart sank. Lady Cordelia Ashford was everything Lyra was not, petite and delicate with golden hair that caught the light like spun silk, porcelain skin that had never seen a day of hard work, and eyes the color of summer sky. Her gown probably cost more than most packs spent in a decade, and she wore it with the casual confidence of someone born to luxury. "Prince Rowan and I discovered our true mate bond just yesterday," Cordelia continued, her voice carrying the perfect modulation of noble breeding. "Such a miraculous thing, don't you think? The goddess works in mysterious ways." Lyra's wolf stirred uneasily. Something about Cordelia's scent was wrong, too sweet, like flowers trying to mask something rotten underneath. "Indeed," King Aldrich said dryly. "Since you've made this journey, you're welcome to stay for the wedding celebrations. Consider it compensation for your trouble." The dismissal was clear, but Lyra found herself trapped. She had no money for the journey home, no escort, and no guarantee that Alpha Blackthorn would even take her back after this humiliation. "That's very generous, Your Majesty," she said carefully. Prince Rowan shifted in his wheelchair, the movement awkward and halting. Perhaps Lady Thornfield would like to see her Q-quarters? The journey must have been tiring. His eyes met hers for a brief moment, and Lyra felt a strange jolt. For just an instant, those pale green eyes seemed sharp and calculating, nothing like the confused, stammering prince he appeared to be. "Of course," King Aldrich waved a hand dismissively. "Captain Drake will show you to the guest wing." A tall man in the Royal Guard's dark blue uniform stepped forward. Captain Drake had the bearing of a career soldier, with graying hair and scars that spoke of real battles. His expression was neutral, but Lyra caught something almost sympathetic in his dark eyes. "This way, my lady." As they left the throne room, Lyra heard Cordelia's tinkling laugh echo behind them. Poor thing. She actually thought she was going to marry royalty. How delightfully naive. The guest quarters were luxurious by any standard, larger than Lyra's entire room back home, with a four-poster bed draped in silk and a fireplace already crackling with warmth. But luxury couldn't ease the sting of rejection or the growing certainty that she was completely alone in a hostile court. Captain Drake lingered in the doorway. "Dinner is served in the Great Hall at sunset. A servant will come to escort you." Thank you, Lyra said, then impulsively added, Captain? How long has Prince Rowan been like this? Something flickered in Drake's expression. Since the border wars, my lady. 3 years now. A great tragedy for the realm. But his tone suggested there was more to the story. Much more. Alone in her room, Lyra tried to process the disaster her life had become. Rejected by her mate, dismissed by a prince, and now stranded in a palace where she was clearly unwelcome. The smart thing would be to find a way home as quickly as possible. But something nagged at her, the way Prince Rowan's eyes had sharpened when he thought no one was looking, the carefully controlled movements that seemed more deliberate than helpless. As evening approached, a young maid arrived to escort her to dinner. The great hall was even more magnificent than the throne room, with long tables laden with enough food to feed her entire pack for a month. Nobles in expensive clothing clustered around the high table where the royal family dined, their conversation a constant hum of political maneuvering and social climbing. Lyra was seated at one of the lower tables, far enough from the royal dais to make her status clear but close enough to observe. Prince Rowan sat beside Lady Cordelia, who kept one perfectly manicured hand on his arm in a gesture that seemed more possessive than affectionate. Such a touching couple, said the woman seated across from Lyra, Lady Margaret something or other, whose nasal voice carried further than she probably intended. Though one does wonder what poor Cordelia will do on her wedding night. I mean, given his limitations. Her companions tittered behind their fans. Lyra's hands clenched in her lap, surprised by the surge of anger she felt on behalf of a man she barely knew. Perhaps you should worry about your own marriage bed, Lady Margaret, she said coolly. I'm sure your husband has his own limitations to discuss. The woman's face flushed red, but before she could respond, Lady Cordelia's voice rang out across the hall. How lovely that little shadow peak decided to honor us with their presence. Cordelia's smile was razor sharp. Though I must say, their fashion sense is quite rustic. Laughter rippled through the hall as every eye turned to examine Lyra's simple blue dress. She felt heat crawl up her neck but kept her expression serene. We prefer substance over style and shadow peak, Lyra replied evenly. Though I can see why some might find that concept foreign. The insult was subtle enough to be deniable, but Cordelia's eyes flashed with anger. How quaint. I suppose when one has so little to work with, one must make do. More laughter, crueler this time. Lyra felt her wolf stirring beneath her skin, claws extending involuntarily. The urge to shift and show these pampered nobles what a real wolf looked like was almost overwhelming. Now, King Aldric's voice cut through the tension. Let's not make our guest feel unwelcome. After all, she's traveled so far to attend a wedding that was never meant for her. The final humiliation. Lyra's face burned as conversation resumed around her, pointedly excluding her from the general flow of court gossip. She forced herself to eat, though the rich food tasted like ash in her mouth. As the evening wore on, she noticed Prince Rowan growing increasingly restless. He kept glancing toward the doors as if planning an escape, his fingers drumming against his wheelchair's armrest with surprising coordination for someone supposedly damaged by war injuries. Finally, he leaned over to whisper something to Captain Drake, who nodded and moved to stand behind the prince's chair. I'm afraid I must retire early, Rowan announced, his stutter notably less pronounced than it had been earlier. The excitement of the day has been overwhelming. Of course, nephew, King Aldric said with barely concealed relief. Rest well. As Captain Drake wheeled him from the hall, Lyra noticed something odd. For just a moment, as they passed near her table, Prince Rowan's foot slipped from the wheelchair's footrest, and she could have sworn she saw him quickly pull it back into position, the movement far too controlled for someone with supposed nerve damage. Curiosity overrode her better judgment. After waiting a few minutes, Lyra excused herself from the table and slipped out of the great hall. The corridors were dimly lit by torches, creating pools of dancing shadow perfect for concealment. She followed the sound of wheels on marble, staying far enough back to avoid detection. Captain Drake was pushing the wheelchair toward what appeared to be a private wing of the palace, their voices carrying softly in the empty hallway. Growing tired of this charade, she heard Prince Rowan say, his voice clear and strong without any trace of a stutter. "How much longer must I play the weakling for my dear uncle's benefit?" Lyra's breath caught. She pressed herself against an alcove, straining to hear more. "Patience, your highness," Captain Drake replied quietly. "King Aldrich grows more suspicious by the day. If he discovers you've been feigning your injuries." "I know." Rowan's voice was grim. "But watching Cordelia simpering over my supposed helplessness makes my skin crawl. And that scene with the Shadow Peak girl tonight." "Lady Thornfield handled herself well," Drake observed. "Cordelia underestimated her." "She did indeed." There was something almost approving in Rowan's tone. "Did you see how her eyes flashed when Cordelia insulted her? For a moment, I thought she might shift right there in the Great Hall." They stopped walking, and Lyra held her breath, afraid they'd somehow detected her presence. "Perhaps having her here isn't entirely unfortunate," Rowan continued thoughtfully. "Someone with so little to lose might prove useful." "Useful how, your highness?" "I'm not sure yet. But something tells me Lady Lyra Thornfield is not quite what she appears to be." Footsteps resumed, fading into the distance. Lyra remained frozen in her alcove, mind reeling from what she'd just heard. Prince Rowan wasn't disabled at all. He was playing some elaborate deception, pretending to be weak and stammering for his uncle's benefit. But why? And what did he mean about her being useful? One thing was certain, she wasn't the only one in this palace hiding their true nature. As she made her way back to her quarters through the shadowy corridors, Lyra couldn't shake the feeling that she'd just stumbled into something far more dangerous than a simple political marriage. The game had changed completely. The question was, did she want to play? Chapter 3. The servants' quarters smelled of lye soap and desperation. Lyra stared at the cramped room with its single narrow window and thin mattress, wondering how her life had spiraled so completely out of control. 3 days ago, she'd been sleeping in Alpha Blackthorn's guest quarters, treated with the grudging respect due a royal bride. Now she was housed with the palace's lowest-ranking staff, her status officially downgraded to unwanted charity case. The change had come swift and brutal after Lady Cordelia's public humiliation at dinner. Apparently, causing a scene, even as the victim, was grounds for immediate demotion in King Aldrich's court. "At least you have a roof," muttered her roommate, a sharp-faced girl named Mira who worked in the kitchens. "Most displaced pack members end up in the dungeons." Lyra turned from unpacking her few belongings. "Displaced pack members? You didn't know?" Myra's laugh held no humor. "The Crown's been relocating werewolf packs for months now. Supposedly for their own protection, but..." She shrugged, the gesture speaking volumes. "What happens to them? Nobody talks about it. Not if they want to keep their positions." Mira lowered her voice. "But the ones who do make it to the capital, they don't last long." A chill ran down Lyra's spine. "What do you mean?" Before Mira could answer, heavy footsteps echoed in the corridor outside. Both women fell silent as 2 guards passed by, their conversation drifting through the thin walls. "Another pack from the Eastern Territories arrived yesterday. Barely 30 survivors out of 200. Orders came directly from the king." The voices faded, leaving an uncomfortable silence in their wake. "See what I mean?" Mira whispered. "Best to keep your head down and your mouth shut." But Lyra had never been good at either of those things. Over the next few days, she threw herself into her assigned duties, scrubbing floors, hauling laundry, and serving meals to nobles who looked through her as if she didn't exist. The work was mind-numbing, but it gave her access to areas of the palace she'd never seen as a guest. It also gave her opportunities to observe Prince Rowan. She began to notice patterns in his behavior that troubled her. During public appearances, he was the picture of fragile helplessness, stammering through conversations, struggling with simple tasks, requiring assistance for the most basic movements. But in the brief moments when he thought no one was watching, she caught glimpses of something else entirely. Like yesterday, when she'd been polishing silver in an alcove near the library. Rowan had entered alone, supposedly to retrieve a book for Lady Cordelia. The moment the doors closed behind him, his posture straightened, his movements became fluid and purposeful, and he'd pulled a book from a high shelf with the easy grace of a natural athlete. When Captain Drake entered minutes later, Rowan had immediately resumed his act, fumbling with the book, nearly dropping it, stammering apologies for taking so long. It was a masterful performance, but it raised disturbing questions. If Prince Rowan was healthy and whole, why was he pretending otherwise? And more importantly, what was he planning? Her chance to find answers came on her 5th night in the servant quarters. Unable to sleep, Lyra had slipped out for some fresh air in the palace's service courtyard. The space was deserted at this hour, nothing but shadows and the distant sound of night guards making their rounds. She was heading back inside when she heard voices coming from what appeared to be an unused storage building. Can't wait much longer. Every day we delay, more packs disappear. Patience, Tobias. Rushing will get us all killed. Easy for you to say, Captain. Your pack isn't in the relocation camps. Lyra crept closer, her wolf's-enhanced hearing picking up every word. Through a gap in the wooden walls, she could see perhaps a dozen figures gathered around a single candle. All of them wore the rough clothing of servants or guards, but there was something about their bearing that spoke of barely contained violence. The plan remains the same, said a voice she recognized as belonging to one of the palace guards, a man with dark hair and scars on his hands who'd served at several formal dinners. Captain Darien, she thought his name was. We gather intelligence, recruit carefully, and wait for the right moment. While our people die in King Aldrich's camps? This from a woman Lyra recognized as Sage, one of the senior kitchen staff. How many more need to suffer before we act? As many as it takes to ensure our success, Captain Darien replied grimly. A failed rebellion serves no one except the executioner. Rebellion. The word hit Lyra like a physical blow. These people weren't just disgruntled servants, they were planning to overthrow the crown. What about the prince? Asked Tobias. Any word on where he stands? Rowan remains an unknown quantity, Darien admitted. His public image suggests weakness, but you have doubts. I have instincts. And my instincts tell me there's more to Prince Rowan than meets the eye. Lyra's heart pounded as the pieces clicked into place. If these rebels suspected Rowan was hiding his true nature, how long before they discovered the truth? And what would they do with that information? Speaking of unknowns, Sage said quietly, what about the Shadow Peak girl? The one they moved to servant quarters? Lady Thornfield? Darien's voice sharpened with interest. What about her? She's been asking questions. Observing things. Yesterday I caught her watching the prince during the afternoon meal service. She had the look of someone seeing past the surface. Dangerous or useful? Tobias asked. Potentially both, Darien mused. Her pack rejected her, the crown humiliated her. She has reason to hate the current system. Or reason to betray us for a chance to improve her standing, Sage pointed out. Only one way to find out, Darien said decisively. We approach her. Lyra's breath caught. She needed to leave, now, before someone discovered her eavesdropping. But as she started to back away, her foot caught on a loose stone. The small sound might as well have been a thunderclap in the quiet courtyard. Inside the building, all conversation ceased. What was that? Tobias whispered. Check the perimeter, Darien ordered. Quietly. Lyra ran. She made it back to her room with seconds to spare, diving under her thin blanket just as footsteps echoed in the corridor outside. Her heart hammered so loudly she was certain Mira would wake up, but her roommate merely mumbled something incoherent and rolled over. The next morning brought disturbing news that drove all thoughts of rebels from Lyra's mind. Diplomatic envoy arriving today, announced Mrs. Hartwell, the head of housekeeping, as she assigned the day's duties. Full formal reception. All hands needed for preparation. Lyra was scrubbing the great hall's marble floors when the visitors arrived. The sound of horses and carriages in the courtyard drew her to one of the tall windows, and what she saw there nearly stopped her heart. Alpha Blackthorn's banner flew alongside the royal colors, and stepping down from the lead carriage was a figure she'd hoped never to see again. Garrett Ironwood looked exactly as she remembered, tall and commanding, his dark hair catching the afternoon sunlight, his presence drawing attention from every direction. He wore formal diplomatic robes that emphasized his broad shoulders and the confident way he carried himself. But it wasn't Garrett who made Lyra's blood turn to ice. It was the woman on his arm. Celeste had never looked more beautiful or more triumphant. Her golden hair was styled in an elaborate updo that showcased diamond earrings, and her deep blue gown was clearly the work of a master seamstress. But it was the way she looked at Garrett, and the way he looked back, that sent daggers through Lyra's chest. The mate bond. They'd completed the mate bond. The betrayal hit her like a physical blow. Not only had Garrett chosen her stepsister over her, he'd bound himself to Celeste with the sacred ritual that was supposed to be eternal and unbreakable. "Impressive delegation," said a voice behind her. Lyra spun to find Captain Darien watching the arrival through another window. In daylight, she could see that her memory had been accurate. He was indeed one of the guards who'd served at formal dinners, with the kind of observant eyes that missed nothing. "You know them?" he asked casually. Lyra's throat felt too tight for words. "They're from my former pack." "Former?" "I was released from my obligations." Something flickered in Darien's expression, understanding, perhaps, or sympathy. "That must be difficult. Watching your past walk through the door." It was more than difficult. It was devastating. But Lyra forced herself to straighten her shoulders and meet his gaze. "The past is done. I'm more interested in the future." "Are you?" The question carried weight beyond its simple words. Because the future has a way of demanding choices from people. Sometimes difficult ones. Their eyes met and held, and Lyra realized this was it, the approach Sage had mentioned. Captain Darien was testing her, probing to see where her loyalties might lie. "I've already made my choice," she said quietly. "When they cast me aside, they lost any claim on my loyalty." "And King Aldrich? Does he have a claim on your loyalty?" The question hung in the air between them like a blade. Lyra thought of the whispered conversations about disappeared packs, of Prince Rowan's mysterious deception, of the rebels gathering in shadowy buildings to plan revolution. "I serve whoever serves my interests," she said finally. "Right now, that's no one." Darien studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Interesting perspective. If you ever want to discuss alternative perspectives, you know where to find me." He walked away, leaving Lyra alone with her churning thoughts and the distant sound of celebration as the court welcomed Shadow Peak's delegation. That evening, she was assigned to serve at the welcome feast, a cruel irony that forced her to watch Garrett and Celeste accept congratulations on their mating while she poured wine and cleared plates like any other servant. "Such a romantic story," Lady Cordelia was saying to the gathered nobles. "True love conquering all obstacles. Though I suppose some obstacles are easier to overcome than others." Her pointed look in Lyra's direction wasn't subtle, and the resulting laughter felt like salt in an open wound. Garrett hadn't looked at her once since arriving. Not when she'd served wine to his table, not when she'd passed directly behind his chair, not even when Celeste had accidentally knocked over her goblet and demanded Lyra clean up the mess immediately. It was as if she'd ceased to exist entirely. "You're gripping that tray hard enough to leave dents," Sage observed quietly as they worked side by side in the serving area. Lyra forced her hands to relax. "I'm fine." "No, you're not. And that's not necessarily a bad thing." Sage's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "Anger can be useful, if properly directed." Another probe. Another test. "What are you suggesting?" Lyra asked. "That some conversations are better held in private. The storage building behind the stables." Midnight. Sage moved away before Lyra could respond, leaving her with a choice that would determine the rest of her life. As the evening wore on and the laughter grew louder around the high table, Lyra made her decision. She would go to that meeting. She would hear what Captain Darien and his rebels had to say. Because watching Garrett and Celeste celebrate their happiness while she served them like a common servant had crystallized something hard and cold in her chest. If the current system could discard her so easily, perhaps it was time for a new system entirely. The only question was whether Prince Rowan's mysterious agenda aligned with the rebels' goals, or whether he represented an entirely different kind of threat. Either way, Lyra was done being a victim of other people's games. It was time to start playing her own. Chapter 4. The blade whistled past Lyra's ear, missing by mere inches. "Dead," Captain Darien announced coldly. "If that had been a royal guard's sword instead of a practice blade, your rebellion would have ended before it began." Lyra rolled to her feet, sweat stinging her eyes despite the midnight chill in the abandoned stable where they trained. 3 weeks of secret sessions had pushed her body beyond limits she'd never known she possessed, but apparently it still wasn't enough. Again, she panted, raising her stolen practice sword. "You're exhausted," Tobias observed from where he sat sharpening his daggers. "Rest for." Again, Lyra repeated, steel threading through her voice. Darien studied her with those calculating eyes that missed nothing. Around them, the other rebels had paused their own training to watch. There was something different about their expressions tonight, a tension that hadn't been there before. "Very well," Darien said finally. "But this time, we're adding pack magic." Lyra's heart stuttered. Pack magic was forbidden to lone wolves, considered too dangerous for anyone without the anchor of a true pack bond. She'd heard whispers of its power, the ability to share strength, speed, and enhanced senses across multiple wolves, but she'd never experienced it herself. "I'm not part of a pack," she pointed out. "You are now," Sage said quietly from where she'd been practicing with throwing knives. "We've been watching you, Lyra. Your instincts, your loyalty, your anger. You're one of us." The words hit harder than any physical blow. After a lifetime of rejection and abandonment, being claimed by this unlikely group of rebels felt like coming home. "The magic requires trust," Darien explained, moving to stand before her. "Complete trust. Can you give that?" Lyra thought of Garrett's betrayal, of Celeste's lies, of every person who'd ever cast her aside. Then she looked around at the faces surrounding her, scarred, determined, united by a common purpose. "Yes," she said. What followed was unlike anything she'd ever experienced. As Darien placed his hands on her shoulders and the other rebels formed a circle around them, power began to flow. Not the wild, individual strength of her wolf, but something deeper and more complex, a network of shared consciousness that linked her to every member of their makeshift pack. Suddenly she could feel Tobias's steady heartbeat, Sage's sharp focus, the quiet strength that emanated from a dozen other rebels whose names she was still learning. And underneath it all, Darien's fierce protective instinct that reminded her painfully of what she'd always craved from Alpha Blackthorn but never received. "Now," Darien said, his voice echoing strangely through their shared connection. "Attack me with everything you have." This time when their blades met, Lyra moved with fluid grace that seemed to come from somewhere outside herself. She could anticipate Darien's strikes before he made them, drawing on Sage's tactical knowledge and Tobias's speed. When he lunged, she wasn't there. When she struck, it was with the combined force of the entire pack flowing through her. For the first time since they'd begun training, she forced him back. "Excellent," Darien murmured as they broke apart, both breathing hard. "You're a natural at this." The praise warmed her more than she wanted to admit. But as the pack magic faded and she returned to herself, exhaustion hit like a physical wall. "That's enough for tonight," Sage said, noting her swaying posture. "Tomorrow we move to Phase 2. "Phase 2? Lyra asked. "Intelligence gathering," Darien explained, his expression growing grim. "We need to know exactly what King Aldrich is planning for the relocated packs. The official records will be in his private study." Lyra's blood chilled. "You want me to break into the king's study?" "Your servant status gives you access to areas we can't reach," Tobias pointed out. "And after tonight's display, you have the skills to get in and out undetected." "What about guards?" "The night watch rotation leaves a 15-minute window around midnight," Sage said. "We've been timing them for weeks. It's our only chance. Lyra nodded slowly, understanding the weight of what they were asking. If she was caught, it wouldn't just mean her death. It would expose the entire rebellion. When? She asked. Tomorrow night, Darian said. During the royal engagement celebration. Of course. While the court celebrated Prince Rowan's upcoming marriage to Lady Cordelia, she'd be risking everything to steal secrets from the king's private chambers. The irony was almost laughable. The next evening, Lyra made her way through the palace's shadowy corridors with her heart hammering against her ribs. The celebration in the Great Hall provided perfect cover, music and laughter echoing through the halls, masking any small sound she might make. King Aldric's study was located in the royal wing, far from the servant quarters where she belonged. Getting there required passing through sections of the palace she'd only seen during formal events, navigating by memory and instinct. The corridors were dimly lit by torches placed at wide intervals, creating pools of dancing shadow perfect for concealment. Her enhanced hearing, sharpened by weeks of training with the rebels, picked up the distant sounds of revelry and the measured footsteps of guards making their rounds. She was almost at the study when she heard voices ahead. Don't care what the physicians say. I know what I saw. Lady Cordelia, perhaps you should discuss this with Prince Rowan directly. He won't listen. He dismisses every concern I raise about that servant girl. Lyra's blood turned to ice. They were talking about her. She pressed herself against an alcove as Lady Cordelia swept past with one of her ladies-in-waiting, their whispered conversation carrying clearly in the quiet corridor. There's something off about her, Vivian. The way she watches everything, takes note of details no servant should care about. And yesterday I caught her listening outside the council chamber. What do you think she's after? I don't know yet. But I intend to find out. They passed by without noticing her, but their words sent chills down Lyra's spine. If Cordelia was already suspicious, how long before her investigation led to the rebels? She forced herself to focus on the mission. The king's study was just ahead, its heavy oak door standing like a barrier between her and the answers they desperately needed. The lock was more complex than anything she'd practiced on, but weeks of training with Sage, who apparently had skills that went far beyond kitchen work, had prepared her for this. Her tools slipped into the mechanism with practiced ease, and after several tense moments, she heard the satisfying click of tumblers falling into place. The door swung open silently on well-oiled hinges. King Aldric's study was exactly what she'd expected, rich dark wood, leather-bound books, and the overwhelming scent of power and privilege. Moonlight streaming through tall windows provided enough illumination to navigate by, casting everything in silver and shadow. The desk dominated the center of the room, its surface covered with documents that made her pulse quicken. Maps of the kingdom with red marks indicating pact territories, correspondence with various nobles, and, most importantly, a leather portfolio marked with the royal seal. She was reaching for the portfolio when she heard it. Footsteps. Not the measured tread of a guard making rounds, but the light, confident step of someone who belonged in this section of the palace. Someone heading directly for the study. Panic flooded her system. There was nowhere to hide, no convenient alcoves or heavy curtains to conceal her presence. The windows were too high to reach quickly, and the door she'd entered through was the only exit. The footsteps stopped just outside. Lyra's hand instinctively went to the knife hidden in her servant's dress, even as her mind raced through possible explanations for her presence. None of them would save her life if she was discovered stealing royal documents. The door handle turned. She tensed, preparing to fight or run or both, when the figure who entered made her forget how to breathe entirely. Prince Rowan walked into the study with fluid, purposeful strides, showing no trace of the halting, uncertain movements she'd grown accustomed to seeing. He moved to his uncle's desk with the confidence of someone completely comfortable in his own body, and when he reached for a drawer, his movements were those of a trained warrior. In his right hand, he carried a sword that gleamed silver in the moonlight. Lyra remained frozen in the shadows by the bookshelf, hardly daring to breathe. This was the confirmation she'd been seeking, proof that Prince Rowan's disability was an elaborate charade. But seeing it with her own eyes sent her mind reeling with implications. If Rowan wasn't disabled, what was he really planning? And why was he here, in the king's study, moving with the familiarity of someone who'd done this before? He found what he was looking for in the desk drawer, a small key that he used to unlock the same portfolio she'd been reaching for. As he opened it and began scanning the documents inside, his expression grew increasingly grim. "Damn," he muttered, his voice clear and strong without any trace of the stutter that plagued his public appearances. "He's moving faster than we anticipated." "We?" Who was we? Rowan pulled out a specific document and held it up to the moonlight, his face set in hard lines as he read. Whatever he was seeing clearly wasn't good news. Lyra knew she should leave, slip away while he was distracted and report back to the rebels with this earth-shattering intelligence. But fascination and a dozen burning questions kept her rooted in place. That's when Prince Rowan looked directly at her hiding spot and smiled. "You can come out now, Lady Thornfield. I know you're there." Her heart stopped. How had he detected her? She'd made no sound, kept perfectly still, controlled even her breathing. "Your scent," he said, as if reading her thoughts. "Orange blossoms and steel. Quite distinctive." Slowly, Lyra stepped out of the shadows, her hand still resting on her concealed knife. Rowan watched her approach with those sharp green eyes that held none of the confusion or weakness he displayed in public. "Your Highness," she said carefully. "Please. At this point, I think we can dispense with formalities." His tone was conversational, as if they'd been properly introduced at a garden party rather than meeting as intruders in the king's private study. "The question is, what brings you here at this particular hour?" "I could ask you the same thing." "You could. But I have a sword, and you have." He tilted his head slightly. "A kitchen knife, unless I'm mistaken. Hardly a fair match." Despite everything, Lyra felt her lips quirk upward. "You'd be surprised what damage a kitchen knife can do in the right hands." "I don't doubt it. Your training with Captain Darien has been quite impressive to observe." The words hit her like a physical blow. "You know about the rebel meetings in the old stable? The pack magic sessions? Your remarkable progress with a blade?" Rowan shrugged, the gesture fluid and controlled. "I make it my business to know what happens in my uncle's palace." "Are you going to turn us in?" "If I were going to expose your little rebellion, don't you think I would have done it weeks ago?" That was actually a very good point. "Then what do you want?" she asked. "The same thing you do, as it happens. Information about King Aldrich's plans for the werewolf population." He gestured to the portfolio in his hands. "Though I suspect our motivations differ somewhat." "And what are your motivations?" Rowan studied her for a long moment, as if weighing how much to reveal. Finally, he seemed to come to a decision. "My uncle believes werewolves are a threat to human rule. He's been systematically weakening pack structures for months, relocating families, breaking up established territories, forcing political marriages designed to create dependencies rather than alliances." "We know about the relocations," Lyra said quietly. "The camps. Those are just the beginning." Rowan's expression darkened. "The documents in this portfolio outline plans for much worse. Mandatory registration, restrictions on shifting, eventual segregation from human populations." The implications sent ice through her veins. That's virtual slavery." "Yes. Which is why I've been working to prevent it." "By pretending to be disabled?" "By being underestimated." His smile held no humor. "My uncle sees me as a useful tool, too damaged to be a real threat, but valuable enough for political marriages and minor treaties. It's the perfect position from which to gather intelligence and interfere with his plans." "You've been feeding information to the rebels," Lyra said, the pieces suddenly clicking into place. "Among other activities. Captain Darien has been very useful, though I suspect he doesn't fully trust my motives." "Should he?" "That depends entirely on your perspective." Rowan moved closer, and despite everything, Lyra found herself responding to his presence in ways that had nothing to do with politics or rebellion. "I don't want to see werewolves enslaved or eliminated. But I also don't want to see the kingdom torn apart by civil war." Sometimes war is the only option. Sometimes. But not always. There are other ways to create change. Such as having allies in positions of power who can work to reform the system from within. He was offering her something, an alternative to the rebels' increasingly violent plans, perhaps. But trusting him would mean betraying everything Captain Darien and the others had built. "Why should I believe you?" she asked. "Because I could have had you arrested the moment you entered this room. Because I could have exposed your rebel friends weeks ago. Because I'm choosing to share information with you that could get me executed for treason." All valid points. But there was something else in his expression, something that made her pulse quicken despite her better judgment. "There's another reason," he said quietly. "Which is? Because despite everything that's happened to you, the rejection, the humiliation, the loss of everything you thought you wanted, you're still here fighting for something bigger than yourself. That kind of strength is admirable." The word sent warmth flooding through her chest, a dangerous feeling she couldn't afford to indulge. "Lady Cordelia is suspicious of me," she said, forcing herself to focus on practical concerns. "I know. I'll handle Cordelia." "How?" "By giving her something else to worry about. Let me handle the politics, Lyra. You focus on your training and your rebel friends." The way he said her name made something flutter in her stomach. Which was ridiculous, considering he was engaged to another woman and she was supposed to be spying on him. "I should go," she said. "Yes, you should. The guards will be making their next round soon." She started toward the door, then paused. "Prince Rowan? If you're lying to me, if this is some elaborate trap." "It's not. How can I be sure?" He moved closer, close enough that she could smell his scent, pine and steel and something uniquely male that made her wolf stir restlessly. "Because I have just as much to lose as you do," he said quietly. "Maybe more." Their eyes met and held, and for a moment the air between them crackled with tension that had nothing to do with politics or rebellion and everything to do with the pull she'd been trying so hard to ignore. Then reality crashed back in, and Lyra forced herself to step away. "This doesn't change anything," she said. "I still have obligations to my people." "I understand. Just, be careful, Lyra. My uncle is more dangerous than you realize, and if he discovers what you're really doing here, I can take care of myself." "I know you can. That doesn't mean I won't worry." The admission hung in the air between them as she slipped out of the study and back into the shadowy corridors. But as she made her way back to the servant quarters, one thought echoed through her mind. Prince Rowan was either the perfect ally or the most dangerous enemy she'd ever encountered. And she had no idea which. Chapter 5. The arrow meant for King Aldric's heart buried itself in the oak tree behind him instead, its black fletching quivering in the morning sunlight. Chaos erupted across the royal hunting party as more arrows whistled through the forest clearing. Nobles screamed and scattered, their fine hunting clothes offering no protection against the sudden violence that had shattered what was supposed to be a peaceful morning pursuit. Lyra, who'd been relegated to the servants following the hunting party on foot, reacted on pure instinct. She tackled Lady Cordelia to the ground just as another arrow sliced through the air where the woman's head had been moments before. "Stay down," Lyra commanded, her enhanced hearing picking up the sounds of at least a dozen attackers moving through the surrounding trees. But even as she spoke, her attention was drawn to the center of the clearing where something extraordinary was happening. Prince Rowan was rising from his wheelchair. Not the careful, labored movement she'd witnessed in his uncle's study, but a fluid surge of power that transformed him completely. The blanket that had covered his supposedly useless legs fell away as he stood, revealing muscles that spoke of years of intensive training. His hand moved to the sword at his side, not a ceremonial blade, but a warrior's weapon that sang as it cleared its sheath. "Protect the king," he shouted, his voice carrying the unmistakable authority of an alpha issuing commands. The royal guards responded instantly, their confusion over their prince's sudden transformation overridden by ingrained training. But they were woefully outnumbered as black-clad figures emerged from the tree-line, their faces hidden behind masks that marked them as professional assassins. Lyra's wolf snarled beneath her skin as she assessed the situation. King Aldrich had taken cover behind his horse, Captain Drake was fighting two attackers simultaneously, and Prince Rowan. Prince Rowan was magnificent. He moved like death given form, his swordwork poetry written in steel and blood. Every strike was precise, every movement calculated to maximum effect. This wasn't the fumbling invalid who'd stammered through court ceremonies. This was a predator in his element, an alpha wolf unleashed. An assassin broke through the guard's defensive line, heading straight for the king with a curved blade gleaming in his hand. Without thinking, Lyra surged to her feet. "Behind you," she called to Rowan, even as she grabbed a fallen guard's sword and sprinted toward the threat. Rowan spun just as the assassin's blade descended, catching the strike on his own weapon with a ring of steel that echoed through the clearing. But the man was skilled, pressing his attack with a series of lightning-fast strikes that drove Rowan back. Lyra hit the assassin from the side, her borrowed sword finding the gap between his ribs with surgical precision. As he fell, she found herself back-to-back with Prince Rowan, both of them breathing hard as more attackers closed in. "I thought you were a servant," Rowan said, deflecting another arrow with his blade. "I thought you were crippled," she shot back, driving her elbow into an assassin's throat. Fair point. They moved together as if they'd been fighting side by side for years, each covering the other's blind spots with an instinctive coordination that spoke of something deeper than mere tactics. When Lyra stumbled over uneven ground, Rowan was there to steady her. When an assassin got inside his guard, she was there with a blade to end the threat. The connection between them was electric, undeniable, and completely inappropriate given that he was engaged to another woman and she was supposedly a rebel spy. The battle ended as suddenly as it had begun. The surviving assassins melted back into the forest, leaving behind their dead and a royal party in complete chaos. King Aldrich emerged from behind his horse, his face pale but his eyes sharp as they fixed on his nephew. "Well," the king said quietly. "That was quite a performance, Rowan." The words carried dangerous undertones that made Lyra's skin crawl. But before anyone could respond, Lady Cordelia's voice cut through the tension. "Your Highness. You're standing." "Oh, thank the goddess, it's a miracle." She rushed to Rowan's side, her face a perfect mask of joy and relief. But Lyra caught something else in her expression, a flash of calculation that was there and gone so quickly she almost missed it. "The shock of seeing danger must have awakened something," Rowan said carefully, allowing himself to sway slightly as if the effort of standing was still difficult. "Indeed," King Aldrich murmured. "How very convenient." The ride back to the palace was tense and silent. Rowan had resumed his wheelchair, playing the part of an invalid still recovering from his miraculous healing, but Lyra could see the strain in his shoulders, the way his hands gripped the chair's arms with white-knuckled force. She walked with the other servants, her mind racing with implications. The attack had been too well coordinated to be random, which meant someone with access to the royal schedule had betrayed their location. Someone close to the king. That evening, as the court buzzed with rumors about Prince Rowan's sudden recovery and the failed assassination attempt, Lyra found herself summoned to an unexpected meeting. Captain Drake appeared at her door just after midnight, his expression grim. "His Highness requests your presence." Immediately. She followed him through corridors she was beginning to know by heart, but instead of heading toward the royal wing, he led her down into the palace's lower levels. Here, the walls were rough stone instead of polished marble, and the air carried the scent of age and secrets. They stopped before a heavy wooden door that Drake unlocked with an ornate key. Beyond lay a room she'd never seen before, part study, part armory, with maps covering every wall and weapons arranged with military precision. Prince Rowan stood at a large table in the center of the room, no longer bothering with his invalid act. He'd changed into dark leather that emphasized his warrior's build, and when he looked up at her entrance, his eyes held none of the confusion or weakness she'd grown accustomed to seeing. "Thank you for coming," he said. "Did I have a choice?" "There's always a choice, Lyra. The question is whether you'll like the consequences." Captain Drake closed the door behind them, leaving them alone in the weapon-filled chamber. Lyra's gaze swept over the maps on the walls, noting the marked territories and supply routes, the careful documentation of troop movements and political alliances. "What is this place?" she asked. "My real office. The center of operations for everything my uncle believes I'm too damaged to manage." Rowan moved to one of the maps, his fingers tracing a route through the northern territories. "Tell me, what did you think of today's attack?" "Professional. Well planned. Someone with inside information arranged it." "Very good. Any thoughts on who?" Lyra studied his expression, looking for clues. "Someone close to the king. Someone who knew the exact route and timing of the hunt. Someone who knew that my uncle has been growing suspicious of my miraculous improvements," Rowan added quietly. "Someone who might have suggested the hunt as the perfect opportunity to resolve two problems at once." The implications hit her like ice water. "You think he arranged his own assassination attempt?" "I think my uncle has been looking for an excuse to eliminate me permanently. Today's attack gave me a choice: maintain my cover and die with the rest of the court, or reveal my true capabilities and face the consequences. And you chose to reveal yourself." "I chose to protect innocent people. Including you." The words hung in the air between them, charged with meaning neither of them was quite ready to acknowledge. "Why?" she asked quietly. "Because." Rowan turned to face her fully, and the intensity in his gaze made her breath catch. "Because when I saw that assassin heading for you, the thought of losing you was more terrifying than any political consequences." The admission sent heat flooding through her chest, dangerous and impossible to ignore. But before she could respond, he continued speaking. "There's something you need to know about my uncle's rule. About why I've been gathering evidence and building networks instead of claiming my rightful place openly." "Your rightful place?" "King Aldrich is not the legitimate heir to the throne." Rowan's voice was steady, but she could see the tension in his shoulders. "My father, Prince Edmund, was the eldest son. The rightful king." Lyra's world tilted. "Was?" "Murdered. Along with my mother and younger sister, when I was 16. Made to look like an accident during a hunting trip, rather like today's attempt, actually." His smile held no humor. "I survived only because I was away at military school. When I returned, Aldrich had already been crowned, and I was a traumatized boy who posed no threat to his new regime." "But you do pose a threat now." "I am the threat now. I have proof of his crimes, documentation of his systematic persecution of werewolf packs, evidence of corruption that reaches to the highest levels of the nobility." He gestured to the maps and documents surrounding them. "And I have allies throughout the kingdom who remember my father's just rule and want to see it restored." "Including the rebels?" "Some of them. Captain Darien has been useful, though he doesn't know the full scope of my plans. I've been feeding him information that serves both our purposes, weakening Aldrich's hold on power while building the foundation for a legitimate transition." "You've been using him." "I've been working with him toward a common goal." "There's a difference." Lyra wasn't sure she agreed, but before she could argue the point, urgent knocking interrupted them. "Your Highness," came Captain Drake's voice through the door. "We have a problem." Rowan moved to unlock the door, admitting his guard whose expression was grimmer than usual. "What is it?" Rowan asked. "The rebels know about your meeting with Lady Thornfield in the King's study 3 nights ago. Someone saw her leaving and reported back to Captain Darien." Lyra's heart sank. "How much do they know?" "Enough to question your loyalty," Drake replied. "Captain Darien is calling for an emergency meeting. Tonight. They think I've betrayed them," Lyra said quietly. "Have you?" Rowan asked, his tone carefully neutral. The question hung in the air like a blade. Lyra thought of the rebels who'd welcomed her, trained her, made her feel like she belonged somewhere for the first time in her life. Then she looked at Prince Rowan, the man who might be the righteous leader they all needed, but who'd been manipulating events from the shadows. "I don't know," she admitted finally. "You need to go to that meeting," Rowan said. "Convince them that you're still loyal to their cause." "Am I?" "That depends entirely on what you believe is best for the werewolf population. Civil war and chaos, or gradual reform under legitimate leadership." Before Lyra could respond, Captain Drake cleared his throat uncomfortably. There's something else, Your Highness. Something about Lady Cordelia. Rowan's expression sharpened. What about her? She was seen entering the king's private chambers an hour ago. Alone. The words hit the room like a physical blow. Lyra saw understanding dawn in Rowan's eyes, followed by something that looked like bitter resignation. Of course, he said quietly. I should have seen it sooner. Seen what? Lyra asked. Cordelia isn't my fiancée by coincidence. She's my uncle's agent, planted to watch me and report on any signs that I'm more capable than I pretend to be. His laugh held no humor. The perfect mate bond she claimed to discover was just another manipulation. How do you know? Because true mate bonds can't be faked. And because I've never felt anything for her beyond mild tolerance. His eyes met Lyra's. Which has been problematic lately. The weight of his gaze made her pulse quicken, but before she could process the implications, practical concerns intruded. If she's been spying on you, she knows about today's performance, Lyra pointed out. Which means Uncle Aldrich will move against me soon. Tonight, possibly. Then what do we do? We? Rowan's eyebrows rose. I thought you weren't sure where your loyalties lay. Lyra looked around the room, at the evidence of years of careful planning, at the maps marking territories where werewolf packs had been relocated or destroyed, at the documentation of crimes that demanded justice. Then she thought of the rebels waiting for her in their shadowy meeting place, expecting answers she wasn't sure she could give. I'm not, she said finally. But I know right from wrong. And whatever else you are, Prince Rowan, you're not wrong about your uncle's crimes. Does that mean you'll help me? The question carried weight far beyond its simple words. Lyra understood that this was a moment that would define not just her future, but the future of every werewolf in the kingdom. It means I'll go to the rebel meeting, she said carefully. And I'll try to convince them that overthrowing one tyrant doesn't have to mean rejecting the possibility of a just king. And if they don't listen? Then we'll have to find another way to stop your uncle before he destroys everything we're trying to protect. Rowan nodded slowly, understanding passing between them that went deeper than words. Be careful, Lyra. If Darian decides you're a threat, I can handle myself. I know you can. That doesn't mean I won't worry. It was the second time he'd admitted to worrying about her, and the confession sent warmth flooding through her chest despite everything. As she prepared to leave for what might be the most dangerous conversation of her life, one thought echoed through her mind. She was about to choose between the rebels who'd accepted her and the prince who might be their salvation. And she had no idea if she was making the right choice. Chapter 6. The screams echoing from the palace dungeons reached Lyra even in her servants' quarters, carried on the pre-dawn wind like the wails of the damned. She jolted upright in her narrow bed, her heart hammering as the sounds painted a horrific picture in her mind. Somewhere beneath the palace's gleaming facade, people were suffering. People she knew. People she'd failed to warn in time. Mira, she whispered to her roommate, but the other girl's bed was empty, the sheets cold to the touch. Gone since yesterday evening, along with half the other servants who'd shown even the slightest sympathy toward werewolf causes. Lady Cordelia's betrayal had been swift and thorough. Lyra dressed quickly, her hands shaking as she pulled on her servant's dress and concealed her knife in its usual hiding place. The corridors outside were eerily quiet, patrolled by twice the usual number of guards whose hard eyes lingered on anyone who moved through the halls. She made her way toward the kitchens, hoping to find Sage or anyone else who might have news, but the normally bustling space was nearly empty. Only Mrs. Hartwell remained, directing a skeleton crew of obviously terrified workers. Where is everyone? Lyra asked quietly. Mrs. Hartwell's face was pale and drawn. Taken in the night. Anyone who'd been seen talking to the wrong people, anyone who'd asked too many questions. Her voice dropped to barely a whisper. They say Captain Darian was caught red-handed with stolen documents. Lyra's blood turned to ice. How many? 15, maybe 20. Including. Mrs. Hartwell glanced around nervously. Including some you might have known. Sage. Tobias. Others whose names she'd never learned but whose faces had become familiar during those midnight training sessions. All of them now in King Aldrich's dungeons, suffering for the crime of wanting freedom for their people. What will happen to them? Lyra asked, though she dreaded the answer. Public execution. Tomorrow at dawn. The king wants to make an example that will discourage any other unrest. The words hit Lyra like physical blows. These people had welcomed her, trained her, made her feel like she belonged somewhere. And now they were going to die because she'd been discovered in that study, because her connection to them had been exposed. Because she'd failed them. I need to go, she said abruptly, turning toward the door. Child, wait. Mrs. Hartwell caught her arm. Don't do anything foolish. There's nothing you can do for them now except get yourself killed too. But Lyra was already pulling away, her mind racing with desperate plans. There had to be something, some way to help them, to make this right. She was so lost in thought that she almost missed the figure waiting in the shadows near the servant stairs. Captain Drake stepped out of an alcove, his expression grim. Lady Thornfield. His Highness requests your immediate presence. Lyra followed him through corridors that seemed to pulse with tension, past guards whose faces she didn't recognize and nobles who whispered in anxious clusters. The very air felt charged with danger, as if the palace itself was holding its breath. They didn't go to Rowan's secret chamber this time. Instead, Drake led her to what appeared to be a storage room in the lower levels, lit by a single candle that cast dancing shadows on the walls. Prince Rowan was waiting inside, but he looked nothing like the composed strategist she'd spoken with the night before. His dark hair was disheveled, his clothes wrinkled as if he'd been pacing for hours, and when he turned to face her, the anguish in his green eyes made her chest tighten. They're going to die because of me, he said without preamble. All of them. Because I wasn't careful enough, because I trusted the wrong person, because I... This isn't your fault, Lyra interrupted, moving closer. Cordelia fooled everyone. I should have seen it. Should have known that someone who claimed to feel a mate bond with me was lying. His laugh was bitter. I've been so focused on playing the long game that I forgot my enemies were playing it too. What do we do now? We? Rowan's eyebrows rose. There is no we, Lyra. You need to leave the palace immediately. Tonight, before Aldrich decides you're too dangerous to let live. I'm not abandoning those people. They're already dead. The words exploded from him with enough force to echo off the stone walls. Aldrich has been planning this for months. The public executions are just theater. He's going to use their deaths to justify even harsher measures against werewolf populations throughout the kingdom. Then we stop him. How? My cover is blown, my allies are captured or scattered, and my uncle now knows I've been working against him. I have maybe hours before he moves against me directly. Lyra studied his face in the flickering candlelight, seeing the weight of failure and responsibility crushing down on him. This was a man who'd carried the burden of his family's murder for years, who'd sacrificed everything to build a network capable of bringing justice to the kingdom. And now it was all crashing down around him. What about the evidence you've been gathering? She asked. The proof of his crimes? Hidden in places only I know about. But what good is evidence if there's no one left alive to present it? An idea began to form in Lyra's mind, desperate, dangerous, probably suicidal. But it was something. What if there was a way to create chaos? Something big enough to distract Aldrich while you retrieved the evidence? Rowan's eyes sharpened. What are you thinking? I surrender myself. Tell him I was the real leader of the rebel movement, that Darian was just following my orders. He'll want to interrogate me, maybe use me as an example alongside the others. Absolutely not. Rowan's voice was flat and final. I won't let you sacrifice yourself for. It wouldn't be a sacrifice, Lyra interrupted. It would be a diversion. While he's focused on me, you get the evidence and find a way to present it to the noble houses. Some of them must still have honor, must care more about justice than political convenience. Even if that worked, which it won't, you'd still be dead. Maybe. Or maybe I'd find a way to escape in the confusion. Lyra, no. Rowan moved closer, his hands coming up to frame her face. I won't lose you. Not after everything not when I've finally found. He stopped himself, but the words hung in the air between them, charged with meaning neither of them had been brave enough to voice. Finally found what? She whispered. You know what, he said quietly. She did know. Despite the impossibility of their situation, despite the political complications and the danger surrounding them, something had grown between them. Something that felt suspiciously like the mate bond she'd thought she'd experienced with Garrett, but deeper and more real than anything she'd ever felt before. Rowan. I know. I know it's insane, I know the timing couldn't be worse, I know I'm still technically engaged to a woman who's been spying on me for months. His thumbs traced along her cheekbones. But I can't pretend anymore that what I feel for you is purely political. What do you feel for me? Everything. Too much. More than I have any right to feel when I might not live to see tomorrow. The admission broke something loose in her chest, a wall she'd built to protect herself from exactly this kind of vulnerability. But looking into his eyes, seeing the truth written there, she couldn't maintain her defenses. The feeling is mutual, she whispered. The space between them disappeared as if by magnetic force. His lips found hers with desperate hunger, and she responded with equal fervor, pouring all her fear and longing and impossible hope into the kiss. This wasn't the careful, calculated kiss of a political alliance. This was raw need and mutual recognition, the acknowledgement of something that transcended logic or convenience. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, the air between them crackled with electricity. Now do you understand why I can't let you sacrifice yourself? Rowan said against her forehead. And now do you understand why I have to? She replied. Those people down there accepted me when no one else would. I won't abandon them to save myself. Then we find another way. There is no other way. You know there isn't. They stared at each other in the candlelit darkness, both understanding the impossible choice before them. Save the rebels and lose each other, or save themselves and live with the guilt forever. If we do this, Rowan said finally, if we somehow pull off this insane plan, what happens after? After? Between us. When the dust settles and the kingdom is safe and you're free to go wherever you want. Lyra thought about it, really thought about what her life might look like if they succeeded. No more pack obligations, no more political marriages, no more serving others' ambitions instead of her own. I suppose that depends on whether you're planning to be a king who keeps his promises, she said. To you? Always. The simple words carried the weight of a vow, and Lyra felt something settle deep in her chest that felt suspiciously like home. Their moment was shattered by urgent knocking on the door. Your Highness, came Captain Drake's voice. We have a problem. Rowan moved to unlock the door, admitting his guard whose expression was even grimmer than usual. What is it? Rowan asked. Garrett Ironwood is requesting an audience. Urgently. He claims to have information about Lady Thornfield's involvement with the rebels. Lyra's heart sank. How could he possibly know about that? Celeste, Drake said quietly. She was seen in conversation with Lady Cordelia yesterday morning. If she knew about your activities and passed that information along. Then Garrett thinks he's here to save me, Lyra finished, understanding dawning with horrible clarity. Save you from what? Rowan asked. From myself. From making choices he disapproves of. From being anything other than the broken little Omega he rejected. Anger flooded through her, hot and sharp. He probably thinks if he rescues me from the rebels, I'll be so grateful that I'll forgive everything and come crawling back to him. Will you see him? Drake asked. Lyra looked at Rowan, seeing her own thoughts reflected in his expression. Garrett's unexpected arrival could complicate everything, or it could provide the perfect cover for their desperate plan. Yes, she said finally. But not alone. And not as his former mate. What are you thinking? Rowan asked. I'm thinking Garrett Ironwood is about to learn what happens when someone underestimates me one too many times. The plan that formed between them over the next hour was even more dangerous than their original idea, but it had the virtue of being completely unpredictable. King Aldrich would expect many things from his nephew and the rebels, but he wouldn't expect cooperation between a spurned mate and the woman who'd rejected everything he represented. As they prepared to put their desperate gamble into motion, Rowan caught her hand. "Lyra. If this goes wrong, if we don't both make it out of this." "We will," she said firmly. "But if we don't, I need you to know." She silenced him with a kiss that tasted of goodbye and desperate hope in equal measure. "Tell me afterward," she whispered against his lips. "When we're both alive to hear it." As they prepared to face whatever came next, one thought echoed through Lyra's mind. She was about to bet everything on a plan that required trusting the man who'd once destroyed her world. And somehow, that felt like the least dangerous part of what they were about to attempt. Chapter 7. The execution platform stood in the palace courtyard like an altar to tyranny, its freshly built wooden frame dark against the dawn sky. Lyra knelt on the rough planks, her hands bound behind her back with silver chains that burned against her wrists. Around her, 15 other rebels waited for death with varying degrees of defiance and terror. Captain Darien knelt directly to her left, his face bloodied but his eyes still fierce with unbroken will. "Still think your prince will save us?" he whispered, so quietly only her enhanced hearing could catch the words. "He'll try," Lyra replied, testing the bonds at her wrists. The silver was already weakening her, making her wolf retreat deep inside where it cowered in pain. "And if he fails? Then we die knowing we fought for something that mattered." Darien's smile was grim but approving. "At least you'll die as a wolf, not a sheep." Below them, the courtyard filled with hundreds of spectators, nobles in their finest clothes treating this like entertainment, common folk who'd been ordered to attend, and scattered groups whose faces showed sympathy rather than bloodlust. King Aldrich sat on a raised dais with the royal family, his expression coldly satisfied as he surveyed his assembled subjects. Lady Cordelia sat beside Prince Rowan's empty wheelchair, playing the grieving fiancé with perfect skill. Rowan himself was supposedly too distraught by recent events to attend the executions, a convenient excuse that allowed him to move freely while his uncle's attention was focused elsewhere. At least, that was the plan. "Citizens of Stormwind," King Aldrich's voice carried easily across the courtyard, magically amplified to reach every ear. "Today we cleanse our kingdom of those who would corrupt our way of life." These traitors sought to undermine human rule, to place werewolf interests above the common good. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, some approving, others uncertain. Lyra caught fragments of conversation that suggested not everyone was convinced by the king's narrative. "The penalty for treason is death," Aldrich continued. "But let it not be said that we are without mercy. Any who confess their crimes and name their co-conspirators will be granted a quick end." His cold gaze swept across the bound rebels, lingering on Lyra with particular intensity. She met his stare without flinching, pouring every ounce of defiance she possessed into that silent exchange. "No confessions?" Aldrich asked when the silence stretched. "Very well. Then you will serve as an example to any who might follow your path." The executioner stepped forward, a massive man whose face was hidden behind a black hood. His silver axe gleamed in the morning sunlight as he took his position beside the chopping block. "Captain Darien Blackwood," Aldrich announced. "You will be first." Darien was hauled to his feet by 2 guards, his chains clanking as they forced him toward the block. But instead of fear, his face showed only contempt. "You can kill me, Aldrich," he called out, his voice carrying across the silent courtyard. "But you can't kill the truth. The people know what you've done to the werewolf packs. They know about the camps, the disappearances, A guard's fist silenced him, but the damage was done. Whispers began spreading through the crowd like wildfire. That's when everything changed. "Stop." The single word cut through the morning air with the authority of absolute command. Every head in the courtyard turned toward the source, the palace's main entrance, where a figure stood silhouetted against the rising sun. Prince Rowan Stormwind walked down the marble steps with fluid, predatory grace that made it impossible to believe he'd ever been disabled. He wore black leather armor that emphasized his warrior's build, and the sword at his side was no ceremonial ornament. Every step radiated power and deadly intent. But it was what he carried in his hands that made the crowd gasp. A wooden chest, bound with iron and marked with the royal seal. "Uncle," Rowan said, his voice carrying easily across the stunned silence. "I believe there are some things the people should know before you execute these brave souls." King Aldric's face had gone white as parchment. "Rowan? But you can't." The injuries were a useful fiction. Much like your claim to the throne. Rowan set the chest down and opened it with deliberate ceremony. "Tell me, uncle, shall I read aloud the confession you wrote after murdering my father? Or perhaps the detailed plans for eliminating every werewolf pack in the kingdom?" The courtyard erupted in chaos. Nobles shouted questions, common folk surged forward for a better view, and guards looked uncertainly between their king and the prince who was clearly no longer the invalid they'd been ordered to dismiss. "Seize him!" Aldric roared, but his command met with confusion rather than immediate obedience. That confusion became full rebellion when Captain Drake stepped out from behind the executioner's platform, flanked by a dozen guards in royal blue who clearly served different masters than their king. "I think not, Your Majesty," Drake said calmly. "These men serve the true heir to Stormwind." The battle erupted on three fronts simultaneously. King Aldric's loyalist guards moved to capture Rowan, only to find themselves facing Captain Drake's men who fought with the coordinated precision of soldiers who'd been preparing for this moment for years. Steel rang against steel as the two forces clashed in the space before the execution platform. At the same time, rebels throughout the crowd threw off their disguises and attacked the guards holding the platform. Sage appeared from nowhere with a set of lockpicks, her kitchen knife between her teeth as she worked frantically at the silver chains binding the prisoners. And in the center of it all, Prince Rowan fought like a man possessed, his sword cutting a path through anyone foolish enough to stand between him and the evidence that would expose his uncle's crimes. Lyra felt her bonds fall away as Sage's picks found their mark. Silver chains hit the wooden platform with a clatter that sounded like freedom bells, and immediately her wolf surged back to life, flooding her system with strength and fury. "Where's your weapon?" Sage shouted over the clash of battle. "I'll find one," Lyra replied, leaping down from the platform into the melee. A loyalist guard swung at her with his sword, but weeks of training with the rebels had honed her reflexes to a razor's edge. She ducked under his strike, grabbed his wrist, and used his own momentum to send him crashing into the platform supports. His sword felt good in her hands, properly balanced, sharp enough to cut through armor if she hit the right spots. She tested its weight with a few practice swings, then threw herself into the battle with savage joy. This was what she'd been born for, not to serve tea to pampered nobles or clean floors on her knees, but to fight for something worth dying for. Every strike she landed was for the packs that had disappeared, for the rebels rotting in dungeons, for everyone who'd ever been dismissed as worthless. She was carving through a cluster of loyalist guards when she spotted Rowan in trouble. He'd fought his way almost to the royal dais where King Aldric waited, but 3 guards had managed to surround him. Even as she watched, one of them got inside his defenses with a lucky thrust that opened a line of red across his ribs. Without thinking, Lyra abandoned her own fight and sprinted toward him, her borrowed sword cutting down anyone who tried to block her path. She reached the group just as one of the guards raised his weapon for a killing blow aimed at Rowan's exposed back. Her blade took the man in the throat, dropping him instantly. The second guard turned toward her with a snarl, giving Rowan the opening he needed to finish the third. They stood back to back in the center of the chaos, both breathing hard, both covered in blood that wasn't entirely their own. "Fancy meeting you here," Rowan said, deflecting another attack. "Just happened to be in the neighborhood," Lyra replied, her sword finding the gap in an attacker's armor. They moved together like they'd been fighting side by side for years, each covering the other's vulnerabilities with instinctive precision. When enemies pressed too close, they shifted seamlessly between offensive and defensive positions. When one stumbled, the other was there to provide support. It was partnership in its purest form, 2 equals united by trust and common purpose. They'd almost reached the royal dais when a new sound echoed across the courtyard, the thunder of approaching horses. "Reinforcements," someone shouted, though it wasn't clear which side the warning was meant for. A column of mounted warriors burst through the palace gates, their horses foam-flecked from hard riding. At their head rode a figure that made Lyra's heart stop. Celeste Thornfield sat her mount like she'd been born in the saddle, her golden hair streaming behind her as she surveyed the battlefield. But instead of the pampered noble's daughter Lyra remembered, this version of her stepsister wore practical leather armor and carried a sword that showed signs of recent use. Behind her rode 24 warriors bearing the Shadow Peak pack colors, along with banners from at least 3 other packs Lyra didn't immediately recognize. "For Lyra Thornfield." Celeste's voice carried across the courtyard like a battle cry. "For the true wolves of Stormwind." The newcomers crashed into the Loyalist Guard's flank with devastating effect. Suddenly the tide of battle shifted decisively in favor of the rebels and Rowan's supporters. King Aldric, seeing his forces crumbling around him, made a desperate decision. "Enough," he roared, his voice magically amplified to cut through the sounds of battle. "I invoke the ancient right of single combat. Prince against king, winner takes the throne." The fighting stopped as if a switch had been thrown. Ancient law was sacred. When properly invoked, single combat superseded all other claims and considerations. Rowan stepped forward, blood dripping from the cut on his ribs but his bearing still proud and strong. "I accept your challenge, uncle. Though the title you claim was never rightfully yours." King Aldric descended from his dais, drawing a sword that gleamed with unnatural light. "Silver-blessed steel," he said with a cold smile. "Consecrated specifically for killing wolves." The crowd formed a rough circle around the 2 men, giving them space for their deadly dance. Lyra wanted to object, wanted to point out that Rowan was already wounded while Aldric was fresh, but ancient law was absolute. This was how it had to be. The 2 men circled each other slowly, each seeking an opening, each measuring the other's strengths and weaknesses. Aldric struck first, a lightning-fast thrust that would have taken Rowan in the heart if he hadn't twisted aside at the last instant. The silver blade sliced through his armor like it was made of paper, opening another wound along his shoulder. Rowan's counterattack was equally swift, his sword seeking the gap between Aldric's breastplate and helmet. But the king was experienced, slipping the strike and responding with a cut that forced Rowan to give ground. They were both skilled, both dangerous, but Rowan was fighting wounded against a weapon specifically designed to kill his kind. Every time the silver blade found flesh, it left burns as well as cuts, weakening him beyond what the wounds themselves should have caused. As the fight continued, Lyra saw Rowan beginning to slow. His movements remained precise, but they lacked the explosive power he'd shown earlier. Silver poisoning was setting in, making his wolf retreat and taking his enhanced healing with it. King Aldric saw it too. His attacks grew more aggressive, pressing his advantage with the ruthless calculation of a man who'd murdered his own brother for power. The end came suddenly. Rowan stumbled, just a tiny misstep, but enough. Aldric's silver blade swept in a devastating arc aimed at his neck, moving too fast for any human reaction to stop it. But Lyra wasn't entirely human. She threw herself between them without thought, without hesitation, without any consideration for her own survival. The silver blade meant for Rowan's throat took her instead, sliding between her ribs with a burning agony that drove all breath from her lungs. Time seemed to stop. She felt the blade pierce her heart, felt the silver fire spreading through her veins like liquid flame. Around her, the world went silent except for Rowan's anguished roar and the sound of her own blood hitting the cobblestones. But even as darkness closed in around the edges of her vision, she saw Rowan's sword find its mark. King Aldric's look of triumph turned to shocked disbelief as steel punched through his chest, ending his reign with a wet, final sound. Lyra. Rowan caught her as she fell, his hands frantically pressing against the wound that was stealing her life one heartbeat at a time. Cc. Did we win? She whispered, tasting copper on her lips. We won. You magnificent, stubborn woman, we won. Tears she'd never expected to see streaked down his cheeks. But you have to stay with me. Do you hear me? You have to fight. She wanted to fight. Wanted desperately to live and see what they could build together. But the silver was spreading, turning her blood to poison, and her wolf was dying deep inside her chest. "I love you," she managed to say, pouring everything she had into those 3 words. "Just in case. I wanted you to know." "Tell me again when you're healed," he commanded, his voice breaking. "That's an order from your king." Darkness reached up to claim her, but his voice followed her down into the shadows, calling her back from whatever place silver-poisoned wolves went to die. Chapter 8. The first thing Lyra felt was warmth. Not the burning agony of silver poisoning that she remembered, but the gentle heat of sunlight streaming through windows and the comforting weight of soft blankets. The second thing she noticed was the hand holding hers, calloused fingers interlaced with her own, thumb stroking across her knuckles with infinite tenderness. "Rowan?" Her voice came out as barely a whisper, throat raw from whatever healing process had brought her back from the edge of death. "Thank the goddess." His voice was rough with exhaustion and relief. "You've been unconscious for 3 days. I was beginning to think." She turned her head to look at him, and her heart clenched at what she saw. Rowan sat beside her bed in what appeared to be the royal chambers, but he looked like he'd been through a war. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, his hair was disheveled, and his clothes were wrinkled as if he hadn't changed them in days. "You look terrible," she managed, which earned her a weak laugh. "You nearly died saving my life. I think I'm entitled to look terrible for a few days." "The silver is out of your system, thanks to Sage's knowledge of healing herbs and Captain Darian's connections with pack shamans." Rowan's grip on her hand tightened. "But it was close, Lyra. Too close." She tried to sit up, pleased when her body obeyed without the screaming protest she'd expected. "What happened after? Did we really win?" "We won." Rowan's smile was the first genuine expression of joy she'd seen from him. "Aldrich is dead, his loyalist forces have either surrendered or fled, and the noble houses have acknowledged my claim to the throne. King Rowan." She tested the title, finding it suited him far better than the invalid prince role he'd played for so long. "It has a nice ring to it." "Does it?" "Because I've been thinking about that, actually." He stood and began pacing, a sure sign he was working up to something important. "The kingdom has been ruled by single monarchs for too long, men making decisions that affect everyone without proper counsel or balance. You want to establish a council? I want to establish a co-monarchy." He stopped pacing and turned to face her fully. "Lyra, I want you to rule beside me. Not as a consort or a figurehead, but as an equal partner with equal authority." The words hit her like a physical blow. "Rowan, that's not how monarchy works." "Then maybe it's time to change how monarchy works." He moved back to her bedside, taking her hands in both of his. "You fought beside me, bled beside me, nearly died protecting me. You've proven yourself more capable of leadership than half the noble houses combined. I'm a foundling with no bloodline, no training in statecraft. You're the woman who inspired rebels to follow her, who convinced enemies to become allies, who faced down a tyrant without flinching." His eyes blazed with conviction. "Bloodline doesn't make a leader, Lyra. Character does. And you have more character than anyone I've ever known. The noble houses will never accept it. The noble houses will accept whatever their rightful king decides. Besides," his smile turned wicked, "most of them are too busy trying to distance themselves from Aldrich's regime to object to anything I propose." Lyra stared at him, her mind reeling with possibilities. To rule as an equal, to help shape the kingdom's future, to ensure that what happened to the werewolf packs never happened again. "There's something else," Rowan said quietly. "Something more personal." "Which is?" He knelt beside the bed, taking her hands in his with the solemnity of a man making the most important decision of his life. "Lyra Thornfield, will you be my mate? Not for politics, not for alliances, but because I love you more than I ever thought possible to love another person." The proposal hung in the air between them, simple and honest and completely terrifying. "Are you sure?" she whispered. "There's still so much we don't know about each other, so many complications. I'm sure that you're the strongest, most courageous, most beautiful woman I've ever known. I'm sure that I'd rather face any challenge with you beside me than rule the entire kingdom alone. And I'm sure that if you'll have me, I want to spend the rest of my life proving I'm worthy of you." Tears she hadn't expected blurred her vision. After a lifetime of rejection and abandonment, someone was choosing her not as a consolation prize or political convenience, but as a first choice. As the only choice. "Yes," she said, and felt something settle deep in her chest that had nothing to do with healing and everything to do with coming home. "Yes to all of it. The crown, the kingdom, you." His kiss tasted of joy and promise and the beginning of everything she'd never dared to dream possible. They were interrupted by a soft knock on the door. Captain Drake entered with his usual professional demeanor, but Lyra caught the hint of a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Forgive the intrusion, Your Majesty, but the preparations are complete." "Preparations?" Lyra asked. "The integration ceremony," Rowan explained. "We're officially incorporating the rebel forces into the Royal Guard, along with implementing the reforms they fought for." An hour later, Lyra stood on the palace balcony overlooking the same courtyard where she'd nearly died. But instead of an execution platform, the space now hosted a very different kind of gathering. Captain Darien stood at attention with the other former rebels, all of them wearing new uniforms that blended royal blue with the practical leather they'd worn as resistance fighters. Sage was there, along with Tobias and dozens of others whose faces had become familiar during those midnight training sessions. By royal decree, Rowan announced to the assembled crowd, "The men and women who fought against tyranny are hereby welcomed into service to the crown. Their ranks, their positions, their authority, all are preserved and honored." Cheers rose from the courtyard, but it was the pride shining in Captain Darien's eyes that made Lyra's throat tight with emotion. These people had been branded as traitors and criminals, but now they stood recognized as the heroes they'd always been. Furthermore, Rowan continued, "The reforms they championed will become the law of the land. Werewolf packs will be granted autonomous territories, the relocation camps will be closed permanently, and discrimination based on species will be punishable by imprisonment." More cheers, but these came from the werewolf population scattered throughout the crowd. Lyra saw faces wet with tears, hands clasped in thanksgiving, hope replacing the fear that had dominated their lives for too long. But it was the movement at the edge of the courtyard that caught her attention. Garrett and Celeste stood together, but their body language spoke of strain rather than unity. Even from a distance, Lyra could see the tension in their postures, the way they avoided looking at each other. "Trouble in paradise?" Rowan murmured, following her gaze. "Their bond was always shallow," Lyra replied. "Based on spite and convenience rather than genuine feeling. Real challenges have a way of exposing that." As if summoned by her words, Garrett looked up at the balcony. For a moment, their eyes met across the distance, and Lyra saw something that might have been regret flicker across his features. But then Celeste tugged on his arm, demanding his attention, and the moment passed. "Do you feel anything?" Rowan asked quietly. "Seeing him again?" Lyra considered the question seriously, examining her heart for any lingering attachment to the man who'd once been her everything. What she found instead was nothing. No love, no hate, no longing or regret. Just the mild interest she might feel for any stranger. "No," she said, surprised by how true it was. "Whatever I felt for him died the night he rejected me. I'm not even angry anymore, just grateful that his betrayal led me here." "Good," Rowan said, slipping his arm around her waist. "Because I have plans for you that don't include pining over unworthy former mates." The week that followed passed in a blur of activity. The kingdom needed rebuilding, new policies needed implementation, and a royal wedding required planning. Lyra threw herself into all of it with enthusiasm that surprised even her. She worked with Captain Darien to establish training programs for integrated forces, collaborated with Sage on supply distribution for the freed werewolf populations, and spent long hours with Rowan learning the intricacies of statecraft and diplomacy. It was challenging work, but fulfilling in ways she'd never experienced. For the first time in her life, she was building something instead of simply surviving it. The mating ceremony took place under the full moon in the palace gardens, witnessed by hundreds of guests who represented every level of society. Instead of the traditional royal protocol, they'd designed something new, part ancient werewolf ritual, part royal tradition, part rebel innovation. Lyra wore a gown of deep midnight blue that Sage had somehow procured from the finest seamstresses in the kingdom. It was elegant without being ostentatious, practical enough for a working queen while still magnificent enough for a royal wedding. Rowan stood waiting for her at an altar decorated with both royal roses and wild forest flowers, wearing formal robes that emphasized his warrior's build while acknowledging his newfound role as king. But it was the expression on his face as she approached that stole her breath. Wonder and love and gratitude all mixed together in a look that said she was everything he'd ever wanted and more than he'd ever dared to hope for. The ceremony itself was a beautiful blend of old and new. Traditional vows were exchanged alongside promises they'd written themselves. Ancient rituals were honored while new traditions were established. And when they finally kissed as king and queen, mates and partners, the cheers from the crowd could probably be heard in the next kingdom. The celebration continued late into the night, but eventually Lyra found herself alone with Rowan in the royal chambers that were now theirs to share. The crown felt surprisingly comfortable on her head, and the ring on her finger caught the candlelight like a promise made manifest. "Any regrets?" Rowan asked, pulling her into his arms. "Only that it took us so long to get here," she replied, then kissed him with all the love and gratitude and wild hope she carried in her heart. They were interrupted once again by Captain Drake, whose timing remained impeccable. "My apologies, Your Majesties, but there's something you need to see." He carried a leather portfolio that he set on the table with unusual ceremony. "We found this among King Aldric's private papers. It concerns Queen Lyra's origins." Lyra's heart skipped. "My origins? Perhaps you should read it yourself, Your Majesty." With trembling fingers, Lyra opened the portfolio and began to read. The first document was a birth certificate, written in formal court script. Luna Princess Lyra Moonwhisper, born to King Edmund Stormwind and Queen Selene Moonwhisper, first of her name. The words blurred as tears filled her eyes. She wasn't a foundling. She wasn't nameless or bloodless or unwanted. She was Rowan's cousin, she whispered. "King Edmund was your father's brother." "Keep reading," Drake said gently. The next document was a letter in King Edmund's hand, addressed to the Alpha of Shadow Peak. "Aldric has made his move against my family. Lyra is the only one who escaped. For her safety, she must be hidden among common wolves until the time comes for her to reclaim her birthright. She is the rightful Luna of Stormwind, the last of the Moonwhisper line. Guard her well." "I was never the substitute," Lyra said, wonder coloring her voice. "I was never second choice or consolation prize. I was the rightful Luna Queen," Rowan finished, his own voice thick with emotion. "Hidden away for your protection, but always meant to rule. Your father saved me. Got me out before Aldric could kill me with the rest of your family. And now you're home," Rowan said, pulling her close. "Finally, completely home." As dawn broke over the kingdom of Stormwind, King Rowan and Queen Lyra stood together on their balcony, watching the sun rise over lands they would rule together. In the distance, they could see the camps being dismantled, the roads filling with werewolf families returning to their ancestral territories, the kingdom beginning to heal from years of tyranny and fear. "What do you think?" Rowan asked, his arm around her waist as they watched their subjects begin another day in freedom. "I think," Lyra said, leaning into his warmth, "that this is just the beginning." And in the growing light of morning, surrounded by the sounds of a kingdom learning to hope again, the Luna Queen who had started as a rejected Omega smiled and began planning the future she would build with the mate who had chosen her heart over her crown, though it turned out she'd been born to wear both all along. Thank you for listening to this wonderful tale. Like, share and subscribe for more. Today is my birthday. Please say a word of prayer for me. Thank you so much. I love you all.